Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Ever wondered why your grandmother threw a teabag into the pressure cooker while boiling chickpeas? Or why she measured using the knuckle of her index finger? Why does a counterintuitive pinch of salt make your kheer more intensely flavorful? On this episode of BIC Talks, we have Krish Ashok, author of Masala Lab, giving us a science nerd's exploration of Indian cooking. This episode is an edited version of the original session by Krish at the Bangalore Literature Festival 2020. Now over to Krish and the art and craft of cooking.
Good afternoon, Bangalore, and everyone else joined virtually. I actually want to start off with a slightly lighter story, which tangentially related to the reason why I wrote the book. A good friend of mine once went to Italy some years back I forgot the last time I traveled, actually, thanks to the pandemic. But, so he went to Italy with his family and he truly enjoyed it. And, he walked into a beautiful small sort of coffee shop in a nice small town. Given as, espresso and cappuccino and all of the terms of coffee are actually Italian in origin. So they kind of perfected the art of making so that kind of espresso coffee, right? And he asked for a latte, like we all do. We walked into a coffee shop. He walked into a coffee shop in Italy and asked for latte. Essentially, they gave him milk. So this is what he got, right? So he thought he'd get this, but they actually gave him milk. So the reason I kind of start with the story is the fact that sometimes, there is tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is that we have unstated understanding of what we're actually talking about. So we don't have to describe the whole thing. So I can walk into a coffee shop in India and say latte, and he's not going to give me milk. He's going to give me latte with coffee, right? In Italian, latte is just latte, which is just milk, right? It's literally the Italian word for milk. And in a sense, the larger point is that sometimes the difference between art and craft is literally this. A lot of art is, in a sense, unstated. It is implicit. In fact, it works because the reader interprets and interpret in their own way. And the richer that interpretation, the better it is. And unfortunately, in a sense, sometimes cooking, at least Indian cooking, and in a sense also aided by Western Orientalization over the years, Asian cooking has always been seen as an art, whereas Western cooking is seen as a craft, if you will. Right. And in a sense, when I looked at the net sum of how we write about Indian cooking, it struck me that we also end up treating it as an art. Right. We use a lot of coded language. A lot of our culinary knowledge is either written in the form of recipes, which miss a lot of the tacit knowledge, or they are written in the form of histories and cultural histories and so on, which are important, but don't necessarily make you a better cook. Right. Just a classic example. Recipes will often tell you cook the tamarind till the raw smell of tamarind goes away. That's actually a terrible description if you want to actually pass on knowledge, right? It's not a craft's way of documenting knowledge, right? A craft's way of documenting knowledge is that cook the tamarind till it's as sour or as less sour as you like it. And even more precisely, food science way of saying it is cook it till the pH goes up, right? So that it's less acidic. It's not overwhelmingly as sour as it needs to be. So this is just one of many examples. So how do people learn to cook? It turns out that people learn to cook by a tiny number actually officially go to catering school, which is in a sense one of the best ways because you're going to learn from the experts. You're actually going to learn the science because at the end of the day, working in a restaurant or working in the food industry, it requires you to understand the science because consistency is important. So the dal that you make today does not have to taste exactly the same as the dal you make tomorrow because at home, one, you're not looking for that consistency. You're looking for some variety, maybe some consistency, but mostly variety, right? So, but the catering school is not a practical way for most of us to actually learn the science of cooking, right? A lot of people end up learning from their mothers and grandmothers, and people in the family, right? Almost like in an apprenticeship mode, right? So you learn by literally cutting vegetables first and watching people and then being given the sort of opportunity to make something on a special day for someone and so on. Most people, when I say most people, most women, men in India rarely cook, which is a terrible thing. This is essentially where that is, right? But the vast majority increasingly augment that knowledge, the ones who have augment that knowledge from the internet, right? So there is no dearth of cooking content. There are some fantastic YouTube channels. There is all the way pioneered by Tarla Dalal and co on, the first generation of basically trying to document recipes and put them out on the internet well before social media and YouTube and so on. It is now a huge, veritable, massive universe of content. So there's no dearth of content, right? But at the same time, the part of the problem with learning to do anything from the internet is that it comes with its advantages and disadvantages, right? In the context of cooking and in the context of most things, you can see this in the misinformation universe that we live in. Content on the internet is optimized by algorithms for popularity and search engine optimization, right? It's not veracity. It's not accuracy. When you search for a recipe, the top recipe you get is not necessarily the best explained recipe, simply the one that did better SEO, right? And the entire universe of cooking content is also recipe centric. And unfortunately, recipes, one, for most part, are not like, scientific white papers. You don't know what all other things did they test, right? When they say quarter teaspoon, when they say, heat it till this happens, it's essentially after the fact attempt at roughly estimating what you did, because nobody's sitting and weighing everything with like precise weighing machines and so on. Some good recipes do, there's no doubt about it, but you don't know which ones they are. So most recipes are untested. And then a lot of recipes end up having this sense of what we call authenticity bias, and therefore actually limit your culinary adventurism. So people will tell you this is authentic. This is an authentic recipe because it uses this ingredient. And if you don't use this ingredient, what you're making is not authentic. And there's an entire subculture of people essentially hating on why somebody else made a Szechuan dosa, as opposed to enjoying the fact that these are actually two fantastic, fusions of cuisines to make something that clearly some people enjoy, right? And literally every recipe is essentially authentic in the context of the home that it was invented in. That's about it, right? There's no two recipes of dal that are the same, no two recipes of avial that are the same. They will use different vegetables. And people kind of get worked up about this because there's this implicit understanding that something has to be authentic, right? So there is that. And then, unfortunately, at least in the context of India, stemming from the fact that we have a very poor healthcare infrastructure in general, there's a ton of nutrition pseudoscience that kind of gets combined into the art of the cooking itself, right? So people are more worried about what nutrition they'll get from whether they're using Himalayan pink salt or regular salt. The scientific answer is no difference. Yeah, you're mostly getting salt. It's a very tiny amount of trace minerals that for all intents and purposes is like homeopathy. It's very over diluted for you to actually get anything, right? So a ton of this stuff is unfortunately there's a ton of nutrition pseudoscience. So when I look at all of this, right, and I really thought to myself in terms of a good recipe is a model. A model is essentially something that gives you instructions in a way. It describes what you need to do, right? My intent is for most part, they don't explain the why, right? They don't tell you why you need to do what you need to do. Why do you need to add the spices to the hot oil? And why does the oil have to be at a very specific temperature? If it's not, you're not going to get much flavor. If it's too hot, it's going to get burnt. Why do you add the water or why do you add the salt at a specific time? Why do some vegetables cook faster than others? Why does chicken often tend to get overcooked all the time? Why do you often make mistakes when you try to bake a large amount of rice? It always turns out to be mushy and so on. So all of these are questions that people have. Recipes don't explain why, right? Or they give you conflicting explanations, right? And Indian cooking is again a misnomer. We have as much culinary variety as Europe and the West put together, just within the subcontinent. There are sub-cuisines, and Indian cooking is also divided by community, religion, and others. There's so much variety in India that it is a pity that we have not thought about it as a craft that needs to be documented through the lens of food science, right? Enough theory there, right? So let me kind of get straight to the book. Just to give you a sense, a teaser, if you will, of the kinds of things that I do, right? Here's an example of how I think about a recipe, as opposed to just a linear instruction of steps that you need to follow with some pictures or a video, right? The way I think about it is to say, let's build a model for the recipe itself, right? Almost all cooking, Indian cooking, starts off with a flavor base that is oil or fat based. It could be ghee, it could be coconut oil, it could be whatever is the regional choice of fat. Then you add very high intensity flavor ingredients like onion, garlic, tomato, and all right into the oil, because all spice flavors dissolve in oil and not necessarily in water, right? So you build a flavor base, and then you have a base gravy, then you have your main ingredients, then you add a stock, which is mostly water, but also you could add meat stock or anything else, or, dal water from the pressure cooker and so on. Then you need an acid so that, the sourness brings that dimension that kind of brings everything together. You add seasoning, both salt and sweet, and then you add some finishing flavors. It could be tadka, it could be garnishing, it could be finishing spices like garam masala, and you could be smoking, to get that sort of smoked flavor and so on. So this is, for example, a model for how you might think about a dal makhani, right? Now, my way of thinking about it is to say that I can actually generalize this to any kind of gravy. And by the way, you could extend this to any style of gravy. So you have a flavor base, you have a base gravy. If you have a set of main ingredients, if it's legumes, you cook it in a certain way. If it's vegetables, you par cook it separately and then add it so that you avoid overcooking, because all of them cook at different rates. If it's meat, you brine it, you marinate it. You have many choices of stock. You could have coconut milk, you could have vegetable stock or chicken stock or water. And then you have variety of acids, right? If you don't have tamarind, by all means, actually, you can use vinegar. By the way, you can make fantastic rasam with vinegar. Just use a little bit, right? It's a pretty strong acid, right? So likewise, you have a ton of seasonings, right? So it's not just salt. There's sugar, there's brown sugar, there's white sugar. All of it have sort of different flavor levels, right? And then different kinds of finishing techniques, right? Now, the reason behind doing this is to say that there's this sort of mental model of how knowledge works in our world, that there is unwritten knowledge and written knowledge, and there's verified knowledge and unverified knowledge, right? So safe to say that published science, properly peer-reviewed and so on, is on the verified written knowledge kind of quadrant. We can argue where it belongs, but generally it's kind of there when done well, right? Popular science is slightly to the unverified side, but it aims to communicate very complicated science. So for example, the book that I'm writing kind of, is aiming to belong there, not necessarily in published science, right? And then there is the internet, right? So internet is a massive spectrum. You don't know what is verified. You don't know what is verified. It kind of spans that entire spectrum, right? Then you have this more real-time transient information. That's the WhatsApp misinformation universe. A ton of people get a lot of their knowledge actually from here, right? And it's largely on the extreme right side for most part, right? And then you have unwritten, unverified knowledge is basically gossip, word of mouth, people talking to each other, and so on. Historically, that's been the case and so on. Now, the thing that is we often miss is that our grandmothers and mothers and people who've been cooking. So people have been cooking for 5,000 years. Okay, I don't want to be a tech pro who comes and says, no, you're doing it wrong. I actually want to say, you know what, we're missing that tacit wisdom, but it's all tacit, right? They know what they're doing. They know how to cook fantastic food. They may not be able to explain why exactly. So the idea is to try and move some of that into this quadrant. So that's the aim of the book, if you will. And food science essentially is just ultimately saying that, look, in a kitchen as a laboratory, what happens when flavor molecules in your spices, proteins, in meat or egg or milk or whatever it is, carbohydrates in all your starchy foods and fats interact with each other at various proportions, temperatures, and pressures. So the industrial food production absolutely requires it. But Indian cuisine, as I said, has a documentation and archival problem because a lot of the tacit knowledge is not described. It's you don't quite describe why you roast spices before you grind them, dry roast spices before you grind them. And you can explain that through the lens of some of the reactions that actually happen. And knowing that will help you actually apply this knowledge elsewhere as well. That's the thing. And then, as I said, very important, grandmothers don't know food science, but they know cooking. Okay? And that's the only knowledge that counts. And so the intent of this book is not to arm people with a sort of, oh, I know this better than my mother and my grandmother, kind of posturing, right? The idea is to actually capture a lot of their tacit knowledge and explain it in ways, most of the things that the cooking practices that they use usually check out in the sense of the fact that it works. Why it works is what we're trying to explain. But a ton of the random misinformation that you see on the internet are the dubious things, right? So I'll start giving some examples. So the book is illustrated by me and by my younger brother, who's a great illustrator. So a little bit of humor. So for example, this is a way of conveying the fact that garlic, depending on how you choose to chop it, can tremendously vary in intensity of the garlic flavor. So if you use like whole slices or whole garlic or slices of garlic, it's going to taste very mild. If you slice it thin, it's going to be sort of medium flavor. Minced garlic is going to be pretty strong. But if you actually use garlic paste, that is going to be insanely strong from the point of view of garlic flavor. And this is because you're actually doing cellular damage. And remember that when it comes to garlic, the cooking process is only reducing its flavor, by the way. So it's your cutting process that is actually determining the final flavor, not so much the cooking at all, to the extent that we tend to cook, right? So of course, if you deep fry it or make it brown, then the flavor is going to change. But so the whole idea here is to explain to people that, look, how you cut your food, cooking starts when you cut food. Because a lot of plant material and vegetables have enzymes. The moment physical damage happens, they start chemically altering the stuff, right? That's why you tear up when you cut onions, the strong smell of garlic, and all of that actually come from essentially physical damage as opposed to actually cooking, using heat. So this is, again, another illustration from the book that explains what is possibly the most important chemical reaction that is useful to understand. You don't need to understand the actual molecules themselves. The flavor profiles are important. So when you actually brown food, that is, when anything that has both proteins, that's amino acids, and sugars, is the starches, right? When you fry it when you saute it above 110 Celsius, it becomes brown, right? And where does that brownness come from? It comes from this reaction, at this temperature between 100 and 150 Celsius, it loses water molecules, which are those sad things walking off at the bottom, to generate a ton of very interesting flavors, which is why browned food is much tastier than the unbrowned version of those things. Right? Roasty and toasty flavors, nutty flavors, that baked flavors, the savory and caramelly flavors, the meaty flavors, herby flavors, all of those kind of come from this browning reaction. And so literally, again, the point here is that any dish you cook, any main ingredient you're using, if you're cooking it in a broth or in water, it won't brown because water boils off at 100 Celsius. If you brown it ahead of time and then add it to the gravy like restaurants do, your cooking will automatically improve. So this is just one of those heuristics that we talk about, right? So the book itself is structured in the form of basics, in the sense of really starting with heat sources, pressure cooking, understanding water, understanding rice, legumes, wheat, vegetables, meat, and eggs and fat, which I think is foundational, if you will. And then flavor, right? Obviously, taste, aroma, mouthfeel, and the art of spices in general. And then browning. Then you have acids and sourness and the different kinds of acids. And then breaking myths and newer techniques, like, the use of umami, the use of baking soda, the use of alcohol in cooking, the use of microwaves, smoking, and newer techniques, and so on. And then we kind of, towards the end of the book, I get into standard algorithms of how to make a generic gravy, how to make any kind of rice dish from anywhere in India, right? How to make any kind of bread, be it from chapati to jawar bakri to anything else, to how to make a universal chutneys from literally anything you want, and salads and so on. And putting it all together in one final chapter, whose name I won't reveal, which I want you to perhaps buy and hopefully be pleasantly surprised by that final chapter, right? So I'll end with kind of 3 common myths that I kind of bust in the book. And again, the one is the fact that pressure cooking is measured in whistles. It's not. It's a myth that actually comes from the fact that everyone ended up having the same stuff in the same pressure cooker. So the frequency between whistles has largely remained the same because the heat you apply is the same. A whistle happens when a pressure cooker reaches full pressure. And when it releases pressure, then it takes a certain amount of time to build that pressure again. So the frequency of the whistles is not a measure of whether the food is cooking. It's only a measure of how much heat you're applying to them, right? So on an induction stove, 3 whistles for rice will result with uncooked rice and dal as well, right? So you have to actually, once it comes to peak pressure, you have to turn the heat down and then measure time, right? So that, in a sense, is essentially how you do pressure cooking, and you'll never fail it, right? And that way you save energy, and also you should never hear more than 1 whistle. Yeah. So if you hear a second whistle, you're probably overheating the thing, right? And obviously also the fact that try not to pressure cook meat unless it is very tough cuts of red meat. Meat cooks at 60 Celsius or 60 to 70 Celsius. Anything more, it's going to get just bone dry and lose water and so on. So this is one thing. The second thing is that you have to knead really well to get soft chapati. No, you can actually let it sit for 30 minutes in water, the dough and water, and the dough will knead itself. I'm not going to get into the actual chemistry of what happens to the gluten there. You read the book and find out. But yeah, you don't have to, if you like working out your deltoids and shoulders, by all means, but you can just let unsalted dough sit for 30 minutes will result in a soft chapati, right? And again, if you understand that the more water you add, the softer the product. If you add eggs and milk, softer the product. If you add more fat, the flakier the product. Right? So Malabar parota has a ton of butter or oil or ghee worked into the dough so that it's flaky. So it's not like chewy, right? So, that's understanding what different things do to dough is essentially one of the common things, right? So you don't have to go by recipes. You can basically cook any kind of bread up in the world, right? The last misconception is that marination adds flavor to meat. It does not. A marination only adds flavor to the surface of the meat. It does not penetrate inside. The only thing that penetrates inside is salt. And to do that, you have to actually brine the meat. You have to soak the meat in salt water, 8% salty water. And the salt, when it goes inside muscle tissues, will help the muscle tissue retain water, right? So it's exactly when you get dehydrated, when you want to drink electrol or whatever it is, it has salt. Why? Because it prevents any further perspiration and loss of water from the muscles, right? And that's why the meat ends up being a lot more succulent at the end of even overcooking, as opposed to, chicken gets really, really dry very quickly because it cooks faster than everything else, right? And then don't over-marinate. Over-marinating in acids will actually spoil the texture of meat. There's no difference between half an hour marination and 24-hour marination, right? And again, to end this, right? So I started with this joke about latte, right? That how you go to Italy and ask for latte, they'll get you milk. Marination is a classic example. The original meaning in the 17th century in Italy, again, where it comes from, is literally to soak in salt water. Marina, marination, it comes from the word for sea, right? But over time, that's not what we do. Now we essentially use, in the context of India, it's yogurt and acids and spices and ginger garlic and we sort of turmeric and everything else, and we let it sit, right? There is a little bit of salt, but clearly not enough concentration for it to actually penetrate into the meat at all, right? So go make some delicious food and hope you enjoy the book. All right. So one of the first questions is, what do you find more challenging and or more satisfying, cooking or music? I think it's hard to pick. I kind of see music as a hobby. I don't see cooking as a hobby. I think cooking is just an essential life skill. If you can make it more fun and make it more, if you will, adventurous, then you can have fun while you're actually indulging in what might be a daily domestic chore, right? So for most people in India who are cooking, it is almost always, it is essentially a woman doing it with little or no choice in the matter, right? So it's hard to sell cooking as some kind of cool, adventurous hobby in that sense. I don't think it should be. I think it's just an essential life skill. And the intent of the book is one, to actually to get better at it, more efficient at it, learn the shortcuts, modern shortcuts that can actually save you time. The use of all these techniques, the use of refrigerators and freezing and all of that will make you faster, quicker, and also make you cook better food in a shorter amount of time, and also make you more adventurous, right? So, that's just the added bonus, if you will. So in that sense, so I wouldn't compare cooking and music. Music is literally purely a hobby. Since I'm not a professional musician, it is something that I absolutely do with the intent of relaxing and enjoyment and the creative joy of actually remixing some fun things and all of that, right? So, that's what I would say. The second question is just like Ayurveda and Western science. So this is Anand Lakshman. There will be a dichotomy in terms of the science, right? So like Rajasic, Tamasic, and Sattvic foods and the mood of the person, spiritual status, and so on. How do we reconcile this to Indian food? It requires a long answer in the sense that one has to kind of get into what is the larger philosophical differences between traditional forms of medicine, like Ayurveda, Unani, what have you, right? Everywhere around the world, and modern medicine, and where the tension and where the overlaps and where the potential sort of lines lie. So I will actually say that I think it's important, if you will, to apply the scientific method to validate some of those methods, right? I think many of those methods do work, definitely, because it's wisdom passed on from the ages. Knowledge that has stood the test of time is almost always works, but you need to be able to explain it so that it can be repeatable. So I'll leave it at that. Does the cooking pot, pan or pot, make a difference in flavors? Not as much as people think it does. But that said, if you're cooking acidic things in a cast iron or copper or aluminium, it will actually worsen the flavor, and especially if the cast iron is untreated. Iron or copper in the metal will react with the acids and form salts, which are not very nice tasting, right? So otherwise, rest is mostly just pseudoscience that, if you cook in an earthen pot, it will be tastier. So remember, there's actually a section in the book that kind of talks about how a lot of the experience of your food is actually related to nostalgia and memory. So that's why your grandmother's dal or sambar is way better than the hotel dal or sambar. Not because it's objectively better, because you have fonder memories of it, right? So it's very similar to, when you kind of used to see that, say, a tin vessel being used to make rasam or a clay pot being used to make a fish curry, and you grew up remembering it, and you kind of know that something that you're eating now was made in that, your brain will automatically make you think that it's actually tastier. So there's a bit of that neurology at play here as well. How do you get paneer kebabs juicy? Sorry, paneer, unlike other animal protein, is not something that absorbs flavors. Okay? And so ultimately, it's about not overcooking it. Paneer does not take much cooking at all. At the moment it loses water, it will get really dry. And the fresher and softer the paneer upfront, the higher quality the paneer, and the higher the fat of the milk that you use to make the paneer, typically buffalo milk paneer is a lot better, and so on. That is what determines whether it's juicy. Very little to do with the cooking process at all. Barbecue at home, get yourself a terrace grill. They're not expensive at all. So I think that's the best way to do it, to get some coals. I think it's if you have a terrace or access to outdoor spaces, that's the way to do it. Are there research forums and journals of cooking sciences? Absolutely. In fact, that was one of my core sources. See, in fact, industrial food science is an academic principle. There's like formal published papers and so on. A lot of that is very inaccessible to the average reading public. So there's a ton of white papers. Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore is actually one of the top publishers in the food science space. In fact, it was one of their papers from the 1980s on the absolute science of fermenting idli batter in terms of urad dal ratio to rice ratio, the kinds of bacteria involved, the kinds of yeast involved, the time, the salt percentage. I mean, it's a 20-page white paper that I used as a reference to write the section on how to absolutely make sure that you ferment idli or dosa batter properly, right? And then I think the other question is, do all ingredients need to be braised, cut, grind pepper rather than whole? Yeah, so yes, very much, depending on the ingredient. Whole spices need to be ground to actually maximize the amount of flavor you get from them. Sometimes it's a stylistic choice to leave them whole so that you want a milder flavor. Works with garlic, works with pepper, any which way. For certain other ingredients, roasting will give you the most amount of flavor. Roasting means that it's cooking well above the boiling point of water, so it gets brown. Braising is something where you're trying to concentrate the juices that come from within the ingredient into the sauce itself, so you kind of thicken it, right? So you typically use for meat, for very highly flavorful meat, typically red meat, so beef, pork, and mutton, and so on, right? Is peeled and chopped onion poisonous if used hours later? There are many things, if you leave them outside for hours, are not going to be good for you. This is as true for onion as it is for most things, especially in a tropical climate. But if it's only 10 or 15 minutes, I don't think it's an issue. It will smell slightly bad, but for most part, you're okay. But there are some things that actually taste better. So lime juice is more flavorful after several hours of being oxidized outside. But on the other hand, orange juice will taste very, very bad, okay, if you leave it outside, and so on.
Krish, to probably end things with the one final fun question, which is kind of contentious. Do you think there is something called vegetable biryani? Someone asked. This is Purnima Prabhu.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, so the first thing, this nomenclature territorialism is complete nonsense. Okay, every home makes food based on their habits, their religious restrictions and culture and so on, in a way that their family enjoys, right? And if somebody wants to make veg biryani, it's as valid a dish as anything else, right? So this entire thing is, as I said, authenticity in food is an entirely silly idea. So in that sense, I think, to be honest, anything goes. Yeah, if you enjoy it, it's food.
Yeah, great. Krish, thank you so much for joining us. Krish' book is available at the bookstore, so please do check it out. Thank you again so much for joining. It seems like a very interesting book. I would love to check it out. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.